Hi, everyone. Here's another plotting tip, and we'll be talking today about dialogue as plotting, as plot action, and it's how to make your dialogue move the plot and mean something for the characters. So I was thinking about this because recently I reread a series of novels that once really enthralled me, and you know how it is when you loved a book 10 years ago and you're wondering if you still love it. Well, I still loved it. This is a Susan Howatch, Howatch novels, and it starts with Glittering Images, and there's 6 novels in the series, and it's compelling, deep, insightful, and thrilling, and it's basically all about vicars and bishops in the Church of England, but really is compelling, interesting. And over the 6 books, almost all the action is conversation. So a troubled character might be confessing or lying or concealing or revealing or arguing or making alliances, all through conversation. So there are therapy sessions with a spiritual advisor. That's sort of like a religious therapist. There are arguments between lovers. Yes, apparently even bishops have secret lovers. There are confrontations with colleagues over office politics, or rather cathedral politics. There are all sorts of conversations which change the course of the story. And I realized what might be static and unmoving, conversations, dialogue, can become dramatic and intense when the conversations are designed to be plot action and plot conflict. So let's discuss how we too can make dialogue into actual actions in our stories. First, let's start with a new definition of action. Well, it's not so new, but it's from theater historian John Barnes. He calls action any irreversible event that changes the course of events in the story, so changes the plot. Remember those 2 factors, irreversible, it can't be taken back. So if Sarah whispers her secret and her friend Clyde says, "What?" because he can't hear her over the sound of his iPhone, and she replies, "Never mind," there's no real action because it's reversed. It's not irreversible, it's reversed. If she rips the earbuds from his head and yells, "They're all aliens and I'm an alien too," into his ears so loud he can't even pretend he didn't understand, that's irreversible. So keep that in mind. Dialogue that can be taken back, that isn't heard, that isn't understood, is not irreversible. It can be reversed. And so that's not action. Action has to be irreversible. And the dialogue event must change the course of events. So if the hero hears a secret but doesn't believe it, maybe Clyde's a scientist and he doesn't cotton to that idea of her being sent by aliens, it's not action because it hasn't changed the course of events. If Clyde doesn't believe it or act on it, it doesn't change the course of events. So it's not action. But if he scoffs and then Sarah shows him this elaborate bracelet of unearthly metal that hides her wrist tattoo, well, then he's got to confront the conflict of his scientific values and her undeniable evidence. She's got this bracelet that's made from metals that aren't available on Earth. So John Barnes says the most active dialogue follows this pattern. One character demands something of another, whether implicitly or explicitly, as Sarah is demanding that Clyde listen to her. The other responds in some way, usually not the right way, or the way the first one wants. So Clyde responds to Sarah by disbelieving her. Sarah then reacts by showing him her otherworldly bracelet. The result is that Clyde reluctantly believes her. So that's demand, response, reaction, and results. Okay? Demand, response, reaction, and results. That is how an effective, active, plot propulsing conversation is structured. So just keep this in mind. Dialogue is interaction. That means these 2 people not only talk to each other, they talk with each other. Not just the individual statements, but the conversation as a whole should have an effect. The way they converse should have an effect. Maybe Clyde's using some intimidating language about taking her to see a psychiatrist. She can interrupt and say, "You're trying to bulldoze me into doing what you want. I'm out of here," and starts leaving. He's got to backpedal, soften his approach, or he'll lose her. And she has to accept this new approach if she's going to continue the conversation. So keep that in mind. It's not just what they say, but how they interact and how they say it. So from speech to dialogue is like action to interaction. How a person speaks is a reflection of who that person is. But speech is not just a means of display, like a peacock's plumage. We don't just speak at each other to prove how articulate or forceful or clever we are. We speak to each other because we want to get something done. So we want to get something communicated. Dialogue is what we get when we engage in that singularly human exercise of speaking to each other. It's dialogue that allows us to have the most complex interactions and relationships and the most agonizing misunderstandings. Language is, of course, meant to communicate, and no matter how often we misinterpret each other, we keep on trying to communicate through words. So that's how language creates connections. But it does more than that. It also powers action. Anyone who's ever tried to find an address in a foreign city knows how essential conversation is to getting something done. You have to be able to say, I want to go to City Hall. I want to catch bus number 18. So let's get beyond the individual voice and speak of voices. Voices that argue, agree, joke, making conversation that matters. So let's think of some conversations and purposes for those conversations in your story. Someone might want to converse in order to persuade, to intimidate, comfort, seduce, build alliances, and so forth. So keeping focused on the purpose or the results of the dialogue, what this conversation can do to these characters. Here are some of the effects that can come right from conversation without any further action. There can be a conspiracy to do something, a breakup, an alliance, a change in vote or position, a change in attitude, a revelation of a secret, a misinterpretation, a surrender, a flirtation. I'll give some examples of most of these in a document that goes along with this. But right now, think about your own characters and your own conversations in your story. Does each of them have some purpose? So the most basic purpose of conversation is exchanging information from one purpose to another. And an information exchange doesn't have to be a quick spill. Look for ways to use the exchange to create conflict and spark action. I am always saying to my clients who are looking for help with plotting, take it slower. Do not spill everything all at once. A conversation, as you know, because you've engaged in many of them, often takes a great deal of time to get to the purpose. This is also what's fun for the audience, is to see the conversation unfold and to see people at cross purposes who end up achieving something. What's important is that the story changes somehow because one character has passed on some information to the other. So make something happen as a result of this exchange. Maybe the two people in the conversation start out by disagreeing what the information is and end up disagreeing about what it means. And then they have to decide to investigate further. Using that same story progression, here are some common events that happen because of the action and interaction and dialogue. Discovery is another form of information exchange, but instead of just passing on what one knows to the other, it results in a revelation of something that neither speaker knew beforehand, that they had to talk together in order to come to this discovery. So talking together helps them put together the pieces of the puzzle. Discovery requires that both contribute some essential fact, and the sum of those essential facts is a new piece of information. This conversation is active because without this particular sharing of facts, the truth wouldn't come out. Okay? So another, which is related, is an alliance. An alliance would be a complicity or some kind of connection between the two characters. It's most fun if the conversation leads them to realize they need to work together, especially if that's a frightening prospect. So they might start out at odds with each other and get to the end of the conversation and realize they have to work together. So then the dialogue is what creates the change. Because remember, the most important thing we want is to create a change. Now, sometimes when people realize they have a common interest, they end up conspiring together. So conspiracy is another action or purpose that can come out of dialogue, a conversation. This involves agreeing tacitly or openly to work together, more or less in secret. Conspiracies are usually secret. So conspiracies can lead to joint action. Use this conversation to set up regular meetings between them, for example, or where they have to act together to further a shared goal. So that shows this can be more fun because there's secrecy involved. Another form that the conversation can end up with is combat. Maybe, I always like to see a change. So if your characters are getting along too well, it's a really good idea to throw in a conversation that leads to greater conflict, that makes them argue with each other, fight with each other. So don't make it too trivial, and aim for some real change in their relationship that reflects some kind of internal conflict between them. They might think they can clear this little problem up, but actually the more they talk, the more at odds they are. This will be especially interesting if it reveals why they're in conflict. So combat is a good thing to come out of a conversation if you want more conflict. Now, something, once you have combat, if you still want these people to work together, the next thing that might happen is treaty. Conflict is the fuel that powers the plot, but you can't have them always fighting. The reader will start to suspect that these two actually don't work well together and shouldn't be allies. So if they've been at odds, a conversation, the next conversation might lead to some sort of truce, reluctant or not. There should always be a change in the state of their being from the beginning of the conversation to the end. So a treaty could lead to some sort of shared decision, taking his car to the crime scene even, something minor like that, to show that the cooperation is not just talk. So you have the conversation, have it lead to an action that shows them working together. One more thing that I want to talk about is deception, because conversations are not always transparent and people do not always have the most honest of motives. So just remember, the act of lying is in itself irreversible. Even if nothing else really comes of it, once you've lied, you can't really go back to no longer being a liar. You're a liar because you lied. And so you can't really turn back. So once it's done, it's very hard to take back, and the resulting mess of admitting to the lie or being caught in it can be extreme. So if one character is deceiving the other, see if you can make him lie directly in this conversation. Speaking it aloud makes him commit more to the deception because he can't take it back now. But also make sure the deception has an effect on the plot. For example, she might rely on what he's told her to make a decision or take an action. Or alternatively, she might recognize it as a lie and the deception destroys her trust. Or she might challenge him and force him to tell the truth. Keep in mind, a lie will almost always be revealed as a lie sooner or later in the story. As President Nixon said, and boy did he know, it's not the crime but the cover-up that gets you in trouble. The very fact that one character lied to the other, even with the best of motives, should create conflict within the liar while it's still secret, and within the relationship when it's revealed. So the revelation of the lie will manifest issues with trust and honor that might have been buried for years. So if there's a lie, have it revealed fairly early in the story so there's time for them to work through the consequences if you want them to end up being alliance. Finally, one last one is the truth. Just like you can't really take back a lie, you can't take back telling the truth. So think about a conversation where a long hidden truth is revealed. That will lead to real change. Just remember to set this up early. After all, if everybody already knows the truth, revealing the truth is not going to be a big deal. But if it's been a secret, or there's been a lie before, or there's been a question that hasn't been answered, that's a way to make sure that telling the truth has consequences. So dialogue takes up a lot of space in a book, and it's particularly appealing to the audience as it reveals the character in so many ways. And also, all of us participate in conversations. We might not be spies, and we might not climb mountains like our characters do, but we all engage in conversations. And probably, if you think back on your life, every single one of those conversations I talked about, you've engaged in at some point. So it really helps the audience participate and get invested in this, because this is something the audience will do on their own too. So don't waste the space. Look at your dialogue passages, especially the long ones, and see how they can be pumped up and rearranged a little bit to affect the plot either now or later. So, for example, that lie she tells in chapter 2, that sure better come back to haunt her in chapter 10 or so. Because one of the things you want to say is that what people speak to each other, the conversations they have consequences for the plot. So I'll post an example of how each of these conversation purposes might work in a story. But right now, how about looking at your own story? Here are some questions you might address. Okay, first, consider some purposes of conversations in your book. The purpose is to the conversants, not just your story. So these two people have a purpose to make this conversation. It might be persuasion, intimidation, comfort, that sort of thing. Choose one of those purposes, and craft the conversation in which the purpose is not fulfilled. In other words, he wants to seduce her, but he doesn't win his goal. But it still advances the plot in some way. In other words, think of the purpose as the beginning point. It's not necessarily what they end up doing. Now, list ways your characters might interact in conversation. For example, they might fight, they might deceive each other and doubt each other, they might interrogate and resist, they might sweet talk, that kind of thing. Choose one and craft a conversation that shows the relationship changing in some way because of the interaction. What I want you to really think about is looking, if you've got a draft done, look at conversations that you already have and see how you can adapt them or revise them to make them more powerful this way. Okay, another thing you want to do is to revise to make the change in the relationship more clear. And so look at the beginning of the conversation and the end of the conversation. How has the relationship changed between the beginning of the conversation and the end of the conversation? This can make the plot go in another direction and also deepen the relationship. So you can probably come up with other ways dialogue can cause change. But the important thing is make the dialogue that you have serve the purpose of change. A change in the relationship and a change in the plot. Look at the passages, especially the long dialogue passages. Make sure that you can revise it to have them affect the plot, either now or later. Okay, one final thought. As I said, take it slow. Make the characters work at it. The key to effective dialogue is that the speakers have to spark a little bit off each other to get to the change point. Without conflict in the conversation, you might as well just summarize it in a narrative. She told him about the paper hidden in the jewelry box. If you're going to have dialogue, make it a lot more interesting than that. Make it more tense and make the tension and conflict of it lead to the change or propel them towards change. As always, anytime you're plotting and writing, if you come up with a complex problem like inactive dialogue and conflictless conversations, talk to me. Email me at plotblueprint@gmail.com and let me know what kind of dialogue issue you have. I love to hear about complicated problems in writing.